Welcome to Glass in Session. This podcast is here to help you fortify your wine studies and arm you with wine buying savvy and hopefully have a little fun doing it. Wine can be such an incredible, fun, delicious journey, and I'm so happy to be part of yours. I'm your host, Val, and I thank you for joining me. This is the last episode in Season 1. Can you believe it? Therefore, I thought it would be appropriate to end the season on a bubbly note, but don't worry, Season 2 is in the works and Glass in Session will return in September. So make sure you've hit the subscribe button in whichever podcast aggregator you use so you're ready to go when Season 2 drops. Or just in case a trailer or random bonus episode should pop up before then, because one never knows. But back to this week. This is part 2 of what I call the Rhône Outliers. Part 1 was actually episode 4 of Season 1. Don't worry, you don't have to listen to that one. That one was about Tavel, Memory Palace, and the weird Sphinx in my living room. But you don't have to listen to that one before listening to this one. So that was all about the rosé-only appellation of Tavel. I had so much information when it came to the Rhône Outliers that realistically I had to split these up into separate episodes. I even have designs on a third part, but it won't be in this season. So I say outliers because these regions or these wines or even historical points might be so unique or fun or interesting, and we rarely hear about them, so I kind of like to dig these things up. And that's why we care about what I call fringe wines. They're cool, they're fringy, they're fun, and depending on where you are, you may see them, you may not. But it's the fun little side notes, the trivia, these rare things that come along, whether you're in your wine studies or sipping your way through a really cool wine list. These things encourage you to keep going if your studying starts to grate on your nerves, and it probably will at some point. Or you just might be in the mood to spice things up again and say, hey, pour me a glass of that. I heard about that on Glass in Session. So where is our foray into fringedom taking us this week? Well, I've already given you some hints in previous episodes, but this session, we are doing the Diois. I feel like I should put some music behind that. Or if you like Diois Diddy Diddy, and I won't sing that song because I don't want to get sued. So the Diois. Hey Val, where is it? What is it? Well, it's a place. It's a wine region. And on a map, it seems a little off the beaten path. So you've got this map of the Rhône and you're doing your studying and you're memorizing the Northern Rhône cruise from north to south. Then you've got this other section over here to the southeast, about 25 miles or so from Cornas. This is a wine region known as the Diois. So it's technically part of the Northern Rhône on a wine map. The wines from this region, which is in the foothills of the Vercors Mountains or the Massif du Vercors, they live in the other category of Rhône wines. So again, if they're in the other category, I'm probably going to cover them. So not so much part of Les Côtes du Rhône, but it's still a Rhône Valley region, so to speak. And so the region is actually named after the commune, I won't say commune, the commune of Die, D-I-E, which to many English speakers spells die. And I should point out that while you're doing your internet search for D-I-E wine, the results that come up are quite interesting. You can get wines to die for. Can you die from wine? It was really interesting. So part of the fun of putting this show together is telling you the weird things that come up when I'm doing the research. But this is in the Drôme department, which is one of 8 departments in the very large Rhône Alps region. This Rhône Alps region extends into the Alps and borders Switzerland. But there are many towns to visit where you can taste the wine, so it's not as small as I make it sound. And there are hundreds of winemakers. I've linked up their mobile app in the show notes in case you're there and you want to start doing some tasting. You can just kind of go through the cities and the winemakers and click, and they give you what they produce, their hours. It's super, super cool. So I found some great resources in this episode too. And even I learned a little something, even though my inspiration from this came from when I was studying for the CWE back in the day. The 4 ladies that did the studying, we had a little study group, and I remember one of the questions just blew me away when it came to studying this region. The Diois, I should say, is also one of France's highest altitude wine regions. The vineyards are at over 2,700 feet on average, and this is also where we find those beautiful lavender fields, not just in Provence. And we have a continental climate, so you got to think about it. We've got varying terroir here. It's got some of that alpine influence because we're at the foothills, but it's also got some of that Mediterranean influence from the south. And this is where we're going to begin. The wine we're going to be talking about today is called Clairette de Die, C-L-A-I-R-E-T-T de Die. First, the wines. Before I get into the Clairette de Die, which used to be the all-encompassing appellation created in the early 20th century, I should mention that since then, there are other AOCs that have come out of this. So I'm going to sum them up really quickly, and then we'll go back to the Clairette de Die. The first one is called Crémant de Die. And you all probably know by now that Crémant is sparkling wine. In the Crémant de Die, the wine has to be produced in the traditional or classic method, as with most regions that boast a Crémant. This means it undergoes that second fermentation in the very bottle in which it's sold. It's a dry, bubbly white, and it's made with Clairette, minimum 55%, Muscat, and Aligoté. And that appellation was created in 1993. There was another one created in 1993. This one is called Coteau de Die. Coteau de Die is a still white wine, a very limited production, and it's made with 100% Clairette grapes. So remember, I told you back in previous episodes, we'd see Clairette again this season, and here it is. We're all up in the Clairette there. But don't get too confused, because when I talk about Clairette de Die, we're not talking about 100% Clairette. So that's going to be fun. You're like, wait, Coteau de Die is 100% Clairette, but Clairette de Die isn't? I'll clarify that in a minute. The third one that was created in 1975 is called Châtillon and Diois. Now, Châtillon and Diois is also a still wine, and it can be red, white, or rosé. So if it's white, it's going to be Aligoté and Chardonnay, kind of like in Burgundy. If it's a red or rosé wine, it's going to be made from Syrah. So you've got that Northern Rhône influence, Gamay and Pinot Noir. You've also got that Burgundy influence, and we'll tell you why that came about as well. So the still wines coming out of there are very limited in production, particularly the Coteau de Die. We don't see a lot of it. So if you see 100% Clairette Coteau de Die, that is a tiny, tiny percentage of the production from this area. If you see the red and rosé and white still wines that have a little bit of Aligoté or Pinot or Gamay in there, also limited productions. The Crémant I was mentioning earlier, it's about 70% of production, or I should say the classic produced. But let's get back to the heart of what I want to talk about today. Because today we're talking about Clairette de Die, and this stuck in my mind because of the grapes. Again, you're probably thinking, geez, Val, well, you keep saying Clairette, so let me guess, we're talking about Clairette today. But, it depends. It depends on which type of Clairette de Die. So let's start splitting that out. Because if we're talking about regular Clairette de Die, well then yes, it's 100% Clairette. Of course, it's sparkling white wine. Simple, right? Very different from Crémant de Die, which is Clairette, Muscat, Aligoté. So Clairette de Die, without some magic words on the label, is going to be 100% Clairette and sparkling. But here's where it gets juicy. If we're talking about Clairette de Die with these magic words on the label, Méthode Dioise Ancestrale, that is the ancient Diois method. Then we're talking about, I don't know why I just get so much joy out of this, 75% Muscat. And then Clairette. What? That's right. Regular Clairette de Die, 100% Clairette. Clairette de Die, Méthode Dioise Ancestrale, 75% Muscat, with Clairette bringing up the rear. These wines comprise about 88% of the Diois production. So this is as of 2016, according to the Cahier de Charge. They actually put this in their 2016 version of the production rule document. So that kind of blew my mind. That's not just a figure I came up with, but I'm pretty sure my translation was somewhat accurate. And like I said, the traditional method bubblies constitute about 7%, according to that document. So we're going to talk mostly about that 88% of the Diois, which is, say it with me, Clairette de Die, Méthode Dioise Ancestrale. But wait, there's more. The Cahier de Charge, or that production document that I so lovingly translated for you, it also says that Clairette de Die, Méthode Dioise Ancestrale can be a rosé. So I need a sound effect because, right around my head, I'm making that motion of the mind being blown. I didn't know that. I've been studying wine for a decade. I had no idea. So in this case, the rosé wines have to be the Muscat Blanc à Petit Grain or Muscat Rouge à Petit Grain. And yes, Muscat Rouge is red Muscat. So the main variety of that 75% of the Méthode Dioise Ancestrale can be Muscat Blanc or Muscat Rouge à Petit Grain. And then the rest of it can be, if it's a rosé, Clairette Blanche, Clairette Rose, which would be the pink version of Clairette that we did talk about in episode 4, And Gamay Noir, no more than 10% Gamay if we're doing a rosé sparkling Clairette de Die Méthode Dioise Ancestrale. How crazy is that? So again, I would have that sound effect in here, but if you're driving and you hear that explosion sound, and like me, you're going to be looking around and I don't want to scare you. So we're not going to put that sound effect in. So just picture me making the mind-blown gestures around my head right now, because it happens every time I put an episode together for you guys. And by the way, if you're making that rosé, the partially fermented juice has to be blended before you put it in the bottle for the second phase of that fermentation process. So that is what we're going to talk about next. Doing the Dioise old school, because by now you're probably wondering, hey Val, Méthode Dioise Ancestrale sounds pretty freaking important on the label. What is it? Well, this is the fun part, and this is our first cork dork alert. The ancestral Dioise process, as it was officially named in 1971, involved not only partial alcoholic fermentation in tank, but then the partially fermented wine was bottled. We all know by now that when you put partially fermented wine in a bottle and seal it, the yeasts continue to eat those sugars and produce alcohol, all the while releasing CO2 or carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide has nowhere else to go, so we call that capturing the sparkle. This naturally shows up in fizz when the bottle is opened and pressure is released. Another fun fact about the origins of the ancestral Dioise method dates back to the ancestors of the Diois known as the Vaucances, and it's spelled Voconces. They were a Gallic tribe, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly because Vaucances is not in Forvo, and they existed around the 1st century. And Pliny the Elder, the vaunted Roman writer, he wrote in the year 77 about how much the Vaucances loved these sweet, sparkling, late-harvest wines. So what was special about them is they put the wine in the jars, they left them in the ice-cold rivers during the winter. Then when they fished them out, they would have a sweet, sparkling wine. Because remember, if the environment isn't warm enough for the yeast to go ahead and metabolize those sugars, they're going to stop. So what's left is sugar in the wine that hasn't been fermented all the way dry. And of course, by releasing that CO2 trapped in the jars, you would get the sparkling wine. So back then, the best way to sell these wines, there were some jars of it around, but most of it was sold in barrels while it was still cold. And often this wine was not good past Easter. But I have to pause and ask, because this reminded me of, I don't know if anybody else did this in high school, but if you lived near water, I lived right on the Potomac River for a couple of my high school years, and we would take these clothes baskets and load them with 6 packs of beer before a bonfire, and we'd tie it to a pier in the Potomac River to keep our beer cold. I don't know if it's just me. It's not really the same thing, but it just kind of reminded me of that story, so I thought that was kind of interesting. Anywho, you're probably thinking, hey, let's get back to that partially fermenting juice in the temperature-controlled tanks or vats, because that's what happens now. The Diois are essentially trying to replicate the whole leaving the wines in the river thing. So they extend the fermentation process over a month or two. Very low, very slow. Then they move the wine to the bottles. And they keep it at a constant 12 degrees Celsius, which is about 53 or 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The minimum time on the lees for the Méthode Ancestrale is 4 months. Then they halt the fermentation when the alcohol is about 7 to 9 degrees. This results in a fizzy, sweet wine. Remember, all that sugar hasn't been converted to alcohol, so the lower the ABV, the sweeter the wine in this case. So while the maximum ABV for Méthode Ancestrale wines from the Diois is 12.5%, normally these wines are going to be about 9% and have an average of about 50 grams per liter of residual sugar. Now here's your second cork dork alert. Yay! In the case of the ancestral method, the cahier de charge dictates a minimum of 3 atmospheres of pressure in the finished wine. This is about 44 pounds per square inch, so think of your car tires. The usual PSI recommendation is less than that, often in the 30s, depending on your car, depending on your tire. But for comparison, it's still half of many champagnes and other classic produced styles, which is around 6 atmospheres or 90-ish PSI, which is about the same as a tractor, trailer, truck tire. Say that 5 times really fast. On a side note, the cork can come flying out of a bottle with this kind of pressure at about 60 miles per hour. So regardless of style, we never point the cork at anyone when opening a bottle of bubbly. Clairette de Die Méthode Dioise Ancestrale wines cannot be released before March 1st, the year following harvest. Remember, they have to spend 4 months on those lees. By law, the minimum residual sugar is 35 grams per liter. But like I said, often it can be a little higher. For the traditional method sparklers I mentioned earlier, or those Clairette de Die made of 100% Clairette, the minimum pressure is 3.5 atmospheres and a minimum of 15 grams per liter after dosage. So the minimum time on the lees for Method Traditionnelle is 9 months, and these wines can't be released before October 1st, the year following harvest. What's interesting is they're probably in the middle of the following year's harvest, if you think about it. So how about some other Diois ditties? And we're going to talk about some history and what they call the Brotherhood. There were some historical references that I was able to dig up. And one of them had to do with King Louis XIII. Apparently, he was passing through Die at one time. They offered him muscat-based wines, so that's kind of the original Clairette de Die wines there. And then in the 1500s, all the neighborhoods in the Die were growing vines. It was documented. So although it was during that time that Clairette, C-L-A-R-E-T, we've heard, or Claret, those wines often refer to the light red wines, as it still does today when we're talking about Bordeaux. The word Clairette, C-L-E-R-E-T-E, or probably Clairette, actually became associated with Die in 1748, and this was according to a notary document from Châtillon in Diois. An article in Le Dauphiné in 1867 described the joyful and sparkling Clairette of Die and its pink foam. And here they spell it C-L-A-I-R-E-T-T-E. So we know that in the 1860s, and this is all before phylloxera, they were making the white and the pink wine, because pink foam, right? So in 1873, there was the Vienna World Fair, and in that catalog, they had listings of Muscat Blanc and Muscat Rosé, sparkling wines from the village of Barzac. And when you think of Barzac, I think a lot of you are defaulting to the Sauternes and the sweet wines of Bordeaux, but Barzac is actually a village in the Drôme. So while the grape varieties and wine styles did change over the centuries to include that influence from Burgundy I mentioned earlier, as well as southern France, it was, as with many other wine regions, that phylloxera came along in the 1870s and changed everything. It wiped out 80% of the vines, and this resulted in the forming of winemaker unions in the 1880s to defend their vines against the scourge. And this is where they had to sit down and decide, well, what grapes do we want to plant? What kind of rootstock do we want to use? But by 1908, these winemakers knew they had something unique, and they began working toward defining their appellation and geographical delimitations and what made them special. In 1910, 41 communes were designated under the general appellation of Clairette de Die, and this included white or rosé sparkling wines, and the original AOC was actually registered in 1942. Geologist and mineralogist Antoine-François Alfred Lacroix wrote about the wines in his 1924 book, and I actually linked up the French version of this book. It's a very old document, and if you go to page 75, you'll see it is in French, but you'll see this book, which was really specific. It had to do with the Crest and Châtillon townships in the Diois. But you can visit these towns today, which is cool. They're on the tourist website. Link that up for you too. And you can check out what he wrote, because he was talking about and I'm going to put quotes around this, western flank of rock mass that occupies the area where the sun ripens the grapes of a sparkling, very pleasant wine. So if you're thinking Lacroix, like the glacier, that's the guy, but he also appreciated what the geology and the geography, the exposure, all these things that we talk about when we talk about terroir, he appreciated that even back then in 1924. So if you want to see the historical document, there's a really cool link in the show notes for that as well. Then in 1988, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I was still in my wine cooler phase, but I was out of the river-cooled beer phase. The winemakers in the Diois got together and they created what they call the Brotherhood of the Companions of Clairette de Die. In French, Confrérie des Compagnons de la Clairette de Die. This is the community composed of hundreds of members, not just growers either. These are people who love Clairette. They kind of want to spread the gospel, if you will, and it's companion bubbly as well, the Crémant de Die. Their charter is, of course, to advocate for these wines, and they also have chapter meetings, festivals, parades, and events throughout the year. I should also mention that members of this community wear capes. The capes are white, and they're trimmed in gold, and when you become a community member, you get to wear the cape. And there's also an accompanying green hat. It looks like a three-corner hat, but I'm not quite sure, but it's a green felt hat. And these colors actually symbolize the wine and the vineyards themselves. I personally have no problem combining wine and capes, just saying, but I think wearing capes and drinking wine is a good place to stop, but not before I quote the motto of the Confrérie des Compagnons de la Clairette de Die. And their motto is, to friendship, and may the joy sparkle. That is a good place to end this episode, I think. To friendship, and may the joy sparkle. And to you, I thank you for subscribing, for listening, for all your comments during this season, all your feedback. Season 2 is going to launch September 13th. Also, if you're going to be in DC in August, it's a Society of Wine Educators Conference. I hope you'll come up and say hi, and I hope to see you there. Meanwhile, feel free to reach out to me between sessions at val@glassandsession.com. I'm on Twitter quite a lot, @WineGalUnboxed. I'm also existing in the Facebook, Pinterest not as much, but the Insta Spaces as Vino with Val. Glass in Session is trademarked by Vino with Val, LLC. Music is by Attic Sound. Website is glassandsession.com/podcast.